Thank you. Okay, great. Everyone can hear. Excellent. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank Rox and Emily for helping to organize this event. When Roxanne approached me about doing this, I'll confess I was both really excited and a little bit daunted. Excited because as an academic, we always like sharing what it is that we're working on with the broader public, and daunted because she insisted that it deal with contemporary issues and questions. And when you live in the 19th century, as I do, they're not always first and foremost some of the ways that these things connect. So I'll start with a disclaimer, and that is it's a common adage that history repeats itself, right? I'm actually someone who's skeptical of that claim. Perhaps history does reoccur. Maybe this is something that happens. Maybe everyone is cyclical, but I'm leery of assuming that to be the case, in part because I think it oversimplifies the past and also the present. History easily becomes a weapon in our own partisan debates, and it's not my desire here today to really fuel any of those partisan debates. In fact, I think history's great benefit is it allows us to get a more complicated understanding of the present by appreciating how complicated the past was. In my view, history sort of flows like a stream, and we never dip our toe directly in the same stream twice. And in fact, I think sometimes if we do think that history repeats itself, especially when we use it to shape policy, it can lead us to draw from the wrong examples. One example relevant for tonight, there's growing evidence that those who planned the Iraq War invasion thought about post-war World War II Japan and to a lesser extent Germany as they planned Reconstruction. Perhaps, and if we have time we can talk about this, perhaps a better analogy would be the post-Civil War South and the quite messier understanding of Reconstruction that emerged in the wake of that event. Nonetheless, this caveat aside, I do think, and the more I've worked on my research in the last year or two, the more I've come to realize that there are some striking parallels between the age that we seem to be living in today and the era where I spend lots of my hours buried away in books and archives. And I hope to illustrate some of those today. I'm going to start with a rather obvious point because I think it's a good thing to do, and that's to stress that, you know what, you may not be surprised to hear this, but we seem to live in a partisan age. I know that this is shocking to all of us, but we actually have some hard data to support the fact that we, in fact, in the United States, are more partisan than we have certainly been in the last 20 years. And let me see if I can get this to work correctly. Oh, here we go. First attempt fails. This is data that shows what's happened in the last 20 years based on polling information. And as you can see, there is a clear bifurcation that seems to be happening within the American political electorate. And this is something that I think we're very much seeing witnessed in the current political debates. Now, for somebody who thinks about what other eras of great tension and conflict and political concern, this is obviously alarming to me. Even more alarming is that it seems we as a people are very distrusting of the other side of these debates. So, for example, this poll suggests that not only do we find the other side, whichever side that might be, to be unfavorable, right, but in fact, we find them to be a threat to the nation's well-being, right? We don't really trust them at all, right? And this is something that I think you can see just in the last 10 years has spiked considerably. For those of you who can't see, 43% of Republicans believe that the Democratic Party is a threat to the nation's well-being. 38% of Democrats believe that of Republicans, right? So this is certainly a trend. I think it's also seems to be the case, as Andrew Sullivan, a political commentator who sort of tried to waffle between these different groups and tried to carve out a moderate path, even suggested a few years ago that we are in the midst of a civil war without violence. right? The Civil War without violence, and we are two countries. This final polling data, and I love polling data because I don't have it in the 19th century, so it's fun to kind of find things that, I just sort of speculate that some or many, and here there's hard data that can be put to it. It seems as if, as a country, we might very well be losing faith in ourselves and in democracy as a whole, right? In 2015, with Americans being polled suggesting that they've lost, they do not have a great deal of trust or confidence in the political wisdom of the American people, right? This is a quite, I think, astonishing concern and quite alarming statistic, if true, and one that I suspect will only become more true if some people's fears are realized in the current political situation. We don't trust one another, right? And I have concerns that this might, in fact, be eroding our sense of what democracy means and its ability to carry out the functions that it has now for over 200 years. Now, we could debate and discuss, and maybe we can sort of converse about what we think are some of the major reasons for this, right? I'd like to suggest that a good bit of the reasons for that stem from larger concerns about global affairs and global concerns that we as a nation struggle to get our minds around, right? So, does anybody think of any recent events that suggest the relevance of international relations or just global events for our own current partisan concerns? Yeah. Okay, so terrorism is clearly on the Americans' consciousness, and that ripples into our whole conversation about national security in important ways. What else? Yeah. World trade, right? After a long period of decades of assumptions of free trade, there's now increased conversation from certain circles about the desirability of protectionism, right? Yep. I saw another hand over here. Immigration. Wow. Yeah. And in fact, in one of the major polls that was done last fall, only 40% of Democrats believe that the immigration systems in the U.S. are working, and only 15% of Republicans, right? This is clearly part of our national conversation, right? Which bridges the domestic and foreign front in really significant ways, right? And we should think about and talk about those things. It's usually said, and it generally might be a truism, that foreign policy seldom determines election outcomes. But I think even if it's not a foreign policy issue, more significantly, these global events bleed into domestic. And our global age, like any global age, are ones in which these distinctions that we sometimes draw between foreign and domestic are artificial and not ultimately that helpful. These issues reminded me of a quote, and I think there's a free T-shirt for whoever can, if I have that authority, whoever can guess the author of this quote, or even get it in the right decade, right? Nations do not now stand in the same relation to each other that they did ages ago. No nation can now shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot round in the same old path of its fathers without interference. The time was when such could be done. Long-established customs of hurtful character could formally fence themselves in and do their evil work with social impunity. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. We'll see. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. Space is comparatively annihilated. I will put good money that almost every one of you have heard of the person who said this. Anybody tell me who it is? Or even what decade this quote may have. Teddy Roosevelt, that's a good guess, but no. Nope, we're getting closer though. Nope, shoot in between Napoleon and Woodrow Wilson and you're getting closer. Nope. Oh, we're really close now. Who, Franklin? Nope. All right, yes, in the back. Yes, this man wins. Frederick Douglass, right? This could have been written from something that happened very recently, right? This almost seems as if it's a product of our own era. But in fact, right, in fact, that man deserves a t-shirt if he doesn't already have one. It is Frederick Douglass, right? A former Maryland slave and prominent black abolitionist who made this declaration in a very famous speech on July 4th, 1852, right? And Douglass's own life, which include 2 overseas trips, I think exemplified this. And he reminds us that, in fact, the processes of globalization that we talk about are not really products of the 20th century, but are products of the 19th century. Political scientists and sociologists and others have started to suggest that there are 3 waves of globalization, and I think this chart, which deals with trade and commerce, exemplifies that, right? Where is it that the world started to become a more integrated place? When is it that this happened, and where is it that it happened? When did we go from just an Atlantic-centered economy, such as the 17th and 18th century, into a truly global one? And there's good evidence to support that it happens before the American Civil War, as evidenced by this, right? And then it tails off in the late 19th century. I don't think it's completely coincidental that World War I happens shortly after the curtailment of some of these global forces, only to rise up a little bit afterwards before again plummeting in the midst of World War II. And then really since then, it's been almost this real straightforward rise up. If you look at 1872, this map, it suggests that, in fact, this is a really integrated world, right? Transportation routes, all of these lines that crisscross this map are places in which people are moving and information is spreading to and fro, right? So now I want to do a little bit of a relationship test, right, to try to get us to think about some of the connections between our own world and the past. That's going to be the first thing I do. Then I'll move to talking a little bit about some misconceptions about what caused the American Civil War. Then thirdly, what it is that happened during the Civil War. And then finally, maybe how the legacy and memory of that war remains problematic for us today. So this is the information age, right? The great information age. And what do we have to show that? We have the internet, right? Here's a map of the under-oceanic cable lines that connect the world that we're a part of. What did people in Frederick Douglass's day have? The telegraph, the electric telegraph, perfected in the 1840s. Lines start to send all over the continent of North America and Europe, and even for a very brief time in 1858 between England and the United States. For only a month did it work, but Queen Victoria sent a very lengthy telegraph to President James Buchanan congratulating them on this great enterprise in Anglo-American relations, right? By the end of the 19th century, this is one company's telegraph line spread throughout the world, right? Space was, as Douglass suggested, sort of annihilated in this sense because information could spread much quicker than it ever could, right? It's not coincidental that a lot of these same lines, parallel where the internet cables of today are sent. Now, what are some other aspects you could imagine of this globalization that are important for understanding the context within which the American Civil War occurred, right? If there are ships traveling all over the place, if there's information spreading about lands far away, what is the likely impact on the public? Well, it's already been mentioned, immigration is a big issue today. You might be surprised to learn that actually immigration per capita was higher in the period before the Civil War than it was in the more recent past, right? If you look here into the United States in the 1830s and 40s, and really all the way up through the 19th century, there are more people legally immigrating into the country than there were in the 20th century. This is a global trend as well as one that affects the United States, right? It's estimated that there are between 1815 and 1915, about 661 people per million move from one country to the next. That actually drops off between just to give you a perspective on that, between 1945 and 1980, that number drops to 221 per million, right? You could argue that in fact the 19th century is an era in which there are more percentages of the population who are moving around the globe seeking new opportunities. Labor markets would be redefined as a result of this, okay? Now, obviously, along with immigration, then and now, came political and societal responses to it. We have our own sort of version of this today, right? Modern nativism, much of it targeting, in particular, the Muslim community, right? And the Mexican community. What did people in the 1840s and 50s in the United States have? The Know-Nothing Party, that's right. And who were the Know-Nothing Party's biggest fears and concerns? Catholics, that's right. What was going to happen? What was going to happen is that bishops and popes were going to arrive on the shores, right? This one has a sword, and he's going to use that sword to sort of take out Uncle Sam and his young children, right? The only hope is to give them the Protestant faith, the Holy Bible, to maybe perhaps ward them away. This is a know-nothing cartoon, a party premised very much on the nativist sentiment and concerns of this large group of immigrants, many of whom are coming from Ireland and Germany in the 1840s and 50s. Now, it isn't just religion that they're worried about, right? And this will be a very big threat to those of you in this room, for many of you, I'm sure. It's also the fact that these Irish and Germans, they like to drink a lot. You know, and you just can't really trust them with their Irish whiskey coming in, you know, maybe getting the rest of the world drunk, the rest of the U.S. drunk, and this German lager. Now, I am somebody who really likes Irish whiskey and German beer, and I'm quite offended by this cartoon, even though it's separated by 150 years. What else is striking about the fear that the know-nothings in this cartoon, what is the big threat that is also here? Yeah. That's right. What are they going to do? They're going to steal the ballot box, right? The most sacred of American practices are going to be sort of taken by these drunkardly Germans and Irish, right? And what else? Any else? Well, in the background, right? What is it that's happening? Chaos, disorder, concerns about rule of law, right? These are very much a part of the American political process. Now the parallels continue. We had in our day the Arab Spring, right? What about people in the 19th century? That's right, right? There's revolutions breaking out throughout Europe in 1848, very diverse in their origin and in their interest and in their goals. But here you have a picture of what's taking place in Berlin in 1848, right? Where the German tricolor flag first gets its real, popular embrace amongst those groups of people who are looking for independence from either traditional empires or unity amongst culturally similar people, right? This is very much what it is that's also fueling the era, right? The age, and what it is. Yeah, please. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know what the, yeah. I mean, I think that the answer is yes. I don't know how advanced the telegraph cables were, and maybe if there's any Germanists amongst us. What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. The question is whether the Arab Spring we associate and affiliate with technological change and social media, and whether the revolutions of 1848 have comparable comparisons, right? I don't know what the telegraphic lines are. We're hearing a no here from Dr. Trausweiser, who would know. Information flows are not in Germany. Okay, so part of the answer to that question is that there's a lot of information that Americans take in from these revolutions. I would say on the American side, there's a clear connection in the sense that you have these celebrity tours that begin to happen amongst revolutionaries in Europe who come to the U.S., use the American print culture, which is quite expansive, to market their goods. In fact, one of the things that some historians have suggested is, you know how you see these images of Civil War folks and they have these really nice, thick beards? That became trendy, supposedly, because Hungarian revolutionaries came over and traveled, and they became almost iconic, and Americans started to say, those beards are pretty handsome-looking things, so we're going to start growing ours out. And in fact, barbers apparently start to become more scarce in the 1840s and 50s. There's fewer of them because there's not as much demand to trim this up. I think the big as to what's going on in Europe during these revolutions of 1848, I've got to imagine that there is a lot of exchange of ideas and information because you're starting to have views and perspectives about what it means to be a nation, right? Everyone starts to believe that they should have their own nation, right? Because it's often said that this is an era of nationalism and of the nation state becoming a defining feature. Whether it will or won't is very much up in the air on the eve of the American Civil War. Exactly. Yes, all of these things in terms of information spreads through Europe, railroads, telegraphs, newspaper print has spread information everywhere, right? So I think that these are in some ways very much important forces. That's a great question. All right. Now, one of the byproducts of this, it used to be that people always thought that the period between the Napoleonic War and World War I was a relatively peaceful period. What is that usually described as? It's the age of what? Oh, what's that? It could be the era of good feeling in the U.S. context. Yeah. Détente? Yeah, okay. Yeah. We like to call it the age of Victoria, too, right? The sort of phenomenal moment of peace and Pax Britannica. Everything is going well. There's not major wars. And to be clear, of the bloodiest 10 wars in human history between rival groups, right, between nation states or empires, none of them happened during this 19th century era, right? But that does not mean that it's not a time of considerable political violence, right? It's, in fact, one of the things that seems to be rising to the forefront in this chaotic global situation where everything seems in flux is the specter of civil war and civil conflict, right? It's not just tensions that exist in the revolutions of 1848, and what in fact happens in most of these European revolutions in 1848. Are they successful? No, most of them are met with conservative counter-revolutionaries that put them down. Perhaps not too unlike many people's perceptions of what's happened with the Arab Spring, right? Now, this sort of political violence is also happening outside of Europe, right? In China, where British military forces have engaged in different wars. In China itself, in the 1850s, a civil war that is estimated to have claimed 30 million lives is taking place, right? Imagine that. We talk about the American Civil War and we know how horrific that bloodshed is, and we've just revised the estimates up to 700,000 lives. Imagine 30 million lives being lost, right? This is what happens in China in the 1850s, 1860s, in the so-called Taiping Rebellion, right? Political violence and civil conflict is also spreading south of the United States, right? Where Latin American republics, many of them claiming independence using the American Revolution as a model, are starting to falter in the 1840s and 50s with civil war in Uruguay and Colombia and elsewhere, right? And in fact, one of the places that Americans in the 1850s are most alarmed about is their southern neighbor to the south, in Mexico, where civil war has again broken out. Since Mexico had earned its independence from Spain in 1821, it had struggled for stability, right? And now Anglo-Saxons of that day blamed it on allegedly inferior genes. We know much better than that, and scholars have shown that the real problem was a massive loan that the Mexican government had taken from European creditors in the mid-1820s that they were never able to fully gain traction in paying off. Massive political instability was one of the results, right? Government after government rose and fell, and by the 1850s, rival governments are claiming their own authority, right? This is the context within which the American Civil War happens. I've heard, I haven't really seen it, but I've heard that maybe the Mexican border is being talked about again recently. I don't know if anybody's heard this or not. You know, we have this discussion here about what's happening along this 2,000-mile long border. You might be surprised to know that in 1858 and 59, these same discussions and conversations are happening in the U.S. context. And in fact, one of the paramount concerns is whether people who do not respect the sovereignty of these two countries or this boundary, don't recognize it, are crossing over it and thus undermining both the Mexican and the American system, right? Robert E. Lee, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, right? We know that he's a prominent Confederate general, the most prominent one. Does anyone want to wager a guess as to where he spends the 18 months before the Civil War? Right down here on this border, right? Where he's hanging out in Texas. His concern, and the reason he's there, is he's worried about cross-border raids coming over into Texas, such as that which occurred in 1858 when a Mexican national, after one of his Mexican workers had been bludgeoned by a constable in Brownsville, he marches over and seizes the town center, right? He's also worried about Comanche Indians who are constantly flowing over and across these boundaries, and as a result, the U.S. Army dispatches him there to keep the peace, right? Partly to keep Americans off of Mexican soil, partially to keep Mexicans and Native Americans in their proper quadrants, as it was seen by the government at that time. I don't think there were any discussions of building walls during this period. There's even some parallels in the fact that what do we have that's defined our economic concerns of the day? It's the 2008 election crash. What is it that those in the pre-1860 period were fretting about? A panic of 1857, right? A global economic crisis, not too dissimilar in terms of its scale and its scope. And all of these things are part of what is swirling in the period prior to the American Civil War. And I want to suggest, and my research is suggesting, that in fact it's crucial that we understand these broader concerns because they're stretching and redefining what it is that Americans expect and think of their country and of their nation, and as a result of their political parties. Okay? So now I'd like to move into what it is that caused the American Civil War and how we can sort of intersect some of these global concerns. And again, feel free to ask questions that can help us elaborate some of these points. All right, now, we have some sense of what Americans today think caused the Civil War. And because the Pew Charitable Trust did a poll at the beginning of the sesquicentennial that asked Americans what caused the Civil War. Does anyone want to wager a guess as to what the ratio is between those who said slavery was what caused the war or states' rights? Well, let's just say what do you think the American public said? Well, there are regional variants, to be sure, but this was a nationwide poll, right? It interviewed a cross-spectrum of the country. Now, I know I have some of my students in my class here, and they've seen the results of this poll. Like, wager, do you think most people said slavery or most people said states' rights? All right, that's right. That's what most people said. Well, not quite a majority, but the closest to a majority was states' rights. 48% of Americans said that this was states' rights that caused the Civil War. Only 38% said it was mainly about slavery. Now, maybe we can use this as a moment to discuss why do so many Americans think that it's about states' rights? And is it about states' rights, do we think? We're on sensitive ground, people. Yeah, okay, Tanner. Okay. Now, what exactly is the state's right that... Yeah, to have slaves would seem to be the great choice. And in fact, right, Southern Democrats who are arguing all the way up to 1860 for the crucial, positions that eventually would lead to secession are not arguing for a limited federal government, right? What are they arguing for? Yeah. That's exactly right, right? The slaveholders are deeply concerned that fugitive slaves are seizing the opportunities that they have available to them, many of them using railways and other of these new technologies, to get up to the north. And what power do they have to make sure that those groups come back? Well, one power that they have would be a federal government that will use U.S. Marshals and will track down fugitive slaves and compel northern states who have passed laws that suggest that those fugitive slaves should be, first of all, there should be a trial that happens to make sure that they're in fact a slave. And also, many northern states say, we don't want our officers and our resources, our jails, to be used in this, right? And so, in this crucial issue, one of the central causes of the American Civil War, it is in fact Southerners who are arguing for a more active federal government that will, you could say, squash northern states' rights. Right? What's the other big issue that is defining the political spectrum in the 1850s? Yeah. Absolutely. The question is, as America, especially after the Mexican-American War has brought much more territory in, right, will slavery be permitted in these territories, right? Guess what Jefferson Davis proposes, the future president of the Confederacy, in the spring of 1860, is the only fair solution in his mind to resolving this tension. He proposes that the federal government needs to pass a slave code that will ensure that slavery isn't just conceivably allowed into these Western territories, but that there are militias that will help to make sure that slaves don't rebel. That there are slave codes that will make sure that any theoretical claims to be able to take your slaves into New Mexico or Colorado, where there's a gold rush that breaks out in 1859, that these theoretical claims will be realized because the arm of the federal government that controls the territories will ensure their rights. Right? That is not a states' rights position. And yet that is the issue around which the Democratic Party in 1860 would splinter, with Southern Democrats believing that they needed to have what was referred to as positive federal protection in the Western territories, right? I think this is a crucial point. Now, it also may go without saying, but it's sometimes thought or perceived that, in fact, slavery was on its way to dying, right? And that really, had there not been a civil war, slavery was going to die out pretty quickly, right? What do we think of that claim? Bunk, why? That's okay. It's a collective story. Exactly, right? The comment is that in fact, right, there are very few signs in 1860 that slavery is going to retreat at all. Americans had, since the American Revolution, kept thinking and hoping and assuming that slavery would somehow go away, it would somehow die out. But history and economics suggested otherwise. Slavery was expanding in large part because the southern cotton planters of the South were at the crucial position of providing an estimated 80% of the world supply of cotton. Easily the most vibrant commercial trade of the 19th century. We have oil, cotton planters, and the world of the 19th century had textiles, and slave-grown cotton was central towards that world production. Okay? So slavery is vigorous. Yes? This shows how dense the slave populations are. I'm sorry the image isn't projecting all that well. So these really dark red areas are between 85 and 95% of the population are slaves, right? So you can see how dense some of these areas are. This is the so-called black belt. You could also line this up with the so-called cotton belt, and it would be almost a perfect approximation of what it is that's taking place, right? Yeah. Slavery was not legal. This is a crucial point. Slavery was not legal in England. It abolished it in the 1830s in its Western Empire. It did not abolish it in its Eastern Empire until much later, right? Or coerced labor. It was also abolished in the French Empire by this point, and everywhere except for Spain. Spain and then Brazil also, so the Spanish colonies of Cuba were important still slave providers. And in fact, right, as Southerners are thinking about seceding, guess where they think they might find partnerships? Right? In the Spanish Empire, right, which still has slavery legal, and possibly even Brazil, right? In fact, after the war, many Confederates flee to Cuba and Brazil afterwards. All right. Now, so I guess if we sort of rewind a little bit, slavery is absolutely central to why it is that the Civil War has happened, why it is that Southern whites have huge fears about what it is that's transpiring in there. Now, paralleling these fears, and I'm not going to go through all of these for the sake of time, these fears become manifest within the American political system, right? But it's important to remember that it's not at all clear to participants at the time. So the era of the 1840s and 50s are an era of remarkable partisanship, right? Tremendous partisanship. People are wearing their party labels, right? But does that mean that a civil war is inevitable? Look at this electoral map. What do you think? Is there anything in 1848, the way that this election breaks down, that makes it seem as if the nation is within 12 years of civil war? Any pattern there that suggests a deep sectional divide? No, not at all. And if you fast forward 4 years more, it even seems less likely that the American electorate is about to launch within the decade the bloodiest war in American history. Right? The Democrats are dominant. Things look relatively good. This should say 1856. I'm sorry about that. But this is 1856. You start to see a little bit more of a regional pattern that is emerging here, with the upper north starting to go towards this new party that only existed for a few years, this Republican Party that used as its base a very small segment of Northerners that had urged free soil or the prevention of slavery. But even here, if you look lower, if you move these numbers a little bit deeper, you can see that there's even mixed results in terms of the presence and dominance of the Republican Party. Why? Right? Well, what are all these yellow dots, these yellow county labels? These maybe refer to. This is like, I feel like John King on CNN. Like, let me zoom in and we'll take a look at the county level results of this. Any guesses as to who these yellow little pockets where they're winning counties are? They don't appear at all on the electoral map. Anybody want to guess what party this is? No one? Somebody said it earlier. The know-nothings. Yeah, the know-nothings are a rising force in American politics. As American politicians and the two-party system grapple with the two main social issues of the 1850s, immigration right? And how to deal with the large number of groups, many of them coming in the north, and with slavery and its continued vibrancy and expansion, right? Now, when you look at the electoral maps like we just looked at, you miss this pattern. You miss this sort of these smaller microcosms of American electorates who are rallying around different issues than slavery, or trying to suppress slavery as an issue. And I think what it reminds us today is that oftentimes political change happens subtly, sometimes beyond the electoral maps that we have become so obsessed with, often in local areas, but always thinking about and grappling with larger global concerns. In fact, the know-nothings are a quite prominent force, even though they start in the north, and in fact win control of governments in New England in the 1850s, they spread to the south. Know-nothingism, unified under a concept known as the American Party, are winning majorities in some of these counties, right? Yeah. Ingo, did you have a question? Oh, okay. So, this is sort of a remarkable and kind of astonishing claim, and it would play, I want to suggest, into how it is that the war itself comes about. So in 1860, you have an election. It's, I would say, the most critical and crucial election in American history, maybe even, will still be the most crucial and critical one after the one that we're looking at today. And it is just a mess, right? All these colors all over the place, right? There's colors everywhere, right? And what does this suggest to us in 1860? Right? What's that? What's that? Partisanship. There is remarkable partisanship. It also suggests you start to see these red dots balloon up in the north. This is Republican Party able to sort of merge with a lot of these know-nothings who they embrace into their own party, while also muting some of their nativism, muting some of their attacks on immigrants, but willing to have them in so that they can defeat the Democrats who are in retreat. And you have Southern Democrats who decide we need our own candidate. We need somebody who will represent our slaveholding interests and will argue in favor of this idea of positive protection, a stronger fugitive slave law. Once the Democrats splinter, right, you have an election in the South in which you have a new party that emerges, constitutional unionists, some of them former know-nothings in the South, who are saying, look, we need to unite. We need the Constitution to help us answer these things. And our biggest threat to that Constitution are immigrants, right? Most of whom are in the North. So imagine the political dialogue that's happening in the election of 1860. You have an extreme Southern party, right, who is arguing that maybe the only path if a Republican is elected, if an anti-slavery Republican like Lincoln is elected, the only pathway forward is secession, versus a more moderate path that is rooted in the idea that the biggest fear and threat to the American country is what? Immigrant groups in the North, right? That doesn't speak well towards Unionists' chances in the post-election debate about whether the South or certain Southern states should stay in or not, right? If you view as the target of your greatest concern these groups in the North that are a threat, many fear. These immigrant groups who are filling the ranks of Northern ballots that are helping Northerners have more votes in the House of Representatives, right? So you have a very, almost sectionalized conversation about politics that these graphs also illustrate. And you have a Republican Party that is able to harness some of the extremes that exist within Northern politics, and a Southern Democratic Party, I would suggest, that is unable of harnessing those extreme ones. And what is the result of that? The result of that is that shortly after Lincoln's election, right, first wave secession happens, and in fact, South Carolina secedes, and then that followed by other Deep South states. Some of these yellow areas in the upper South remain loyal and in the Union. Okay, they're resistant of this. All right, I want to just stress another point here about sort of what it is the Confederacy stood for at that time, because I think it's an important point to clarify. It's often said that the Confederacy was built upon states' rights. And there are certainly, as they talk about their Constitution, that becomes an important component of it. But they also sort of had a first principle that underlined that, and the vice president of the Confederacy stated it quite boldly, right, in March of 1861, in which he said, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal," right? Its foundation, the Confederates, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, right? That slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. That was the Confederacy's first principle, and they didn't let that principle get in the way of states' rights. And in fact, the Constitution says that no state can pass a law that interferes with property in slavery. Right? And with some great irony, the preface to the Confederate Constitution suggests that it was to form a permanent federal government, implying that perhaps secession wouldn't be legal under the Confederate Constitution. Right? All right. Again, the Confederates' hopes still rest on this larger global view that slavery and it's important for the cotton trade are going to help them sort of supplant any rivals. We can think of it as only a backward-looking, but I want to suggest the Confederacy is also forward-looking in the sense that they believed that they stood for progress with the slave system, showing to the rest of the world that slavery could work in the modern era. All right, let's turn our attention a little bit to maybe thinking about why it is that Northerners cared. Why Lincoln gets elected, and why decide that you're going to try to fight a war to keep people who don't want to be in your country part of your country. I think this is one of the great questions in history that still we have to sort out. Why go to war to keep these guys in, right? 5 years before secession happens, many Northerners are saying, good riddance. If we can get rid of slaveholders, my goodness, that'd be fantastic, right? We can do all the things that we want to do, like build a railroad to the Pacific that they keep blocking, or give out free Western lands to people. So why do Northerners care? Yeah. There's a lot of concern about this. Is secession going to mean that the Confederacy is going to not pay their debts, which are owed to New York merchants, to New York business people, and the like? That is a huge concern. Absolutely. So that is one factor of it. But many people say, and Jefferson Davis's government says, trust us, we'll pay. Just let us go peacefully. Why else? Any other guesses? I want to suggest that part of it was considerable embarrassment. Right? A fear that what secessionists had done was to threaten and challenge America as the last best hope for Republican government throughout the world. What had happened to those revolutions of 1848? They had faltered. What had happened to the republics in Latin America? They had failed. Where was Republican government going to stand up and show that it could stand in this era of swirling change? Lincoln would famously say that it was in the United States that it was the last best hope on earth for the principle of self-government. And that seems sort of, for our more cynical age, that seems sort of like, what? Really? No. But in the context of the 1850s, it was very much, you could make the case that this was going to happen. And secession had suggested that the United States was weak, right? The eagle had become this sort of meager little bird with its feathers plucked. This is, I think, part of the motivation for it. That motivation was chiefly around rallying behind the flag, rallying behind the Union, rallying behind the Constitution, but it was informed very much out of fears that Europe, with a divided nation, would eventually come back in. And those fears had warrant, because in 1863, that's what Napoleon III of France did. Marched his army straight into Mexico, created a puppet regime, and tried to show a different model for what North America would become, one independent of Republican government and instead dependent on monarchy. Now, let me move to a next point. Are there any questions at this point? I want anything that, yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things is that secession equals anarchy, right? And I think one of the things that resonates maybe in some ways with us today is that both sides, right, the Confederacy and the Union, are hyper concerned about what sovereignty means, right? How do you show that you can control all of the things that the governments can control all the things that they need to control? And for the Republic and for the Confederacy, right, they install it in their Constitution that it's going to be a permanent government. The threat of political anarchy, which they're seeing throughout the world, is a very real one, right? And so, yes, secession is, it's not a large step. And in fact, William Seward makes exactly those claims, right? What's going to happen if we allow secession to happen? We're going to look like China. We're going to look like Italy. He makes these very direct comparisons to what he sees the rest of the world becoming, right? Already, even before the American Civil War. And America, and he embraces this ardent American exceptionalism, is not that, right? And in fact, you could say that the Civil War and a Union victory suggests to the rest of the world that democracy and Republican governments are strong, not weak, which is what most European powers assumed, right? European conservatives said, oh, the Civil War is going to happen. Of course, because we know Republican governments are fragile and they can't mobilize enough support. And there's no way, they said, the Union is going to win. There's no way they're going to win. And when they do, European powers sort of said, whoa, maybe we were wrong about this thing called democracy. And it empowers liberals. It's one of the global ramifications of the war. It empowers them to say, you know what, maybe government by the people can also be a strong, militarily strong government. All right, we're running short on time. And rather than sort of continue talking about some of the fog of war and some of the other things that may connect the dots a little bit, maybe I'll just open it up now to any questions or conversations that people want to have. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 So this is a great point and a great question. And the question is sort of what about these bankers in New York especially, and how do they react throughout this entire crisis? And they react in a nonlinear way. Their initial reaction when secession happens is to say, "Whoa, this is bad. What's going to happen here?" Right? They urge compromise. They basically go to Buchanan and they say, "Look, we're not going to buy in to any of the the U.S. government's broke. Before the Civil War happens, the U.S. government is broke, right? It has a deficit and it has a debt. Much of it incurred due to the Mexican War, some of it due to a war in Utah. And bankers say, we're not going to pay. We're not going to buy these loans that you need to keep the government opening. I mean, there's concern about a shutdown until you push compromise, and until you replace the Secretary of State, who they believe to be a secessionist. And once they do that, they do buy in. They keep the government afloat throughout that period. And they continue to send some resources in, but they do not on equal ground. So by the summer of 1861, after the war goes hot, you're right. Samuel Chase goes and says, we're going to invest in smaller bonds and notes, and we're going to ask the American people to support this government, right? So you're right in the sense that New York merchants are divided. I think the best way to describe it is that they're divided on it. There are some who even support the idea of New York becoming a free port, in which basically they will sort of economically secede from the Union so that they can have free trade with the Confederacy, right? That becomes a proposal that the mayor, Fernando Wood, actually floats. So it's a complicated story, but it's also the case that Jay Cook comes to the rescue of Philadelphia banker, and New Yorkers start to fall a little bit more in line as a result. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think that this is, I mean, I think one of the things that a crisis like secession creates or civil war creates is obviously remarkable anxiety. And in the context of the 1860s, that anxiety was often expressed in a very powerful, the only way to remedy our prestige is to really sick it to those Southerners who have fired upon the flag. And Fort Sumter and the firing upon Fort Sumter by the Davis administration is a turning point in which the war hawks seize that moment and say, this is the only solution to this problem, is war. So I think that that is a crucial one. But I also think it's interesting in that it seems like any of these crises are also moments in which people start to talk about first principles. And you have a lot of Republicans, including Lincoln, who start to say, you know what is it that this government is about, and what does it mean? And so you'll see, if you read his inaugural address, it's an invocation of how the country begins even before the Declaration of Independence, and that the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that it was created upon requires us, necessitates us to do this. Now, he, in fact, kind of redefines what the nation means, I would suggest, in that it's not just the sum of its parts, but it's, in fact, an organic whole, right? And the German philosopher and first political scientist in the country, Francis Lieber, starts to talk in this way as well. The nation is an organism, right? And it must be made great on the national stage. And I would suggest part of that is due to these concerns about European intervention, European alliance with the South. And so, yes, there's a mixture of sort of this bluster, but also this larger, deeper conversation that happens within both governments. The Confederate government chooses, as I've suggested at least, as its first principle, this idea that slavery is going to be paramount, and they insert it all over the Constitution, whereas the 1787 one hadn't said anything about it. And that's a really novel idea, right? And a horrendous idea, but a novel one, that we're going to found this country based on the idea of inequality. What other modern country has sort of put that into its governing document? In the North, a similar conversation happens, but one that actually is in part because Republicans start to deliver on their campaign promises. Is allowed to sort of grow towards a different end. And one end, and this is the important point, I guess, is that end also redefines what the country is, including African Americans as being part of it. Right? The Confederate first principles prevents them until the last weeks of the war from even considering using 40% of eligible male military men, right? Slaves. They won't put them in the field. The North and its definition of nationalism is able to include them, right? Doesn't mean that equal rights are going to happen, but are able to include them. And that's in large part because, I guess the final point is that these civil wars create moments of opportunity for those who are subjugated and those who are marginalized, right? That's certainly true in the Civil War, whereas this postcard, which I found in a Philadelphia archive, suggests, as northern and southern whites duke it out on Virginia's back on the Old Dominion, you have a slave family that runs across that no man's land and makes known their willingness to fight and support for that union. And so I think you see a real interesting redefinition of what the nation is. One can hope that our larger debate over immigration and these other issues, including, one could say, the deficit, creates a larger conversation that leaves us better off, right? But I don't know whether I'm overly optimistic. Maybe you guys have other thoughts. Mm-hmm.